Morning all. Okay, so obviously we still don't know exactly how all the process is going to work in terms of submitting your marks. There will be, remember though, the option to if however they pull through the marks, you're not happy with it, there'll be the option to sit exams as soon as the schools reopen, basically. And even potentially, if you then kind of change your mind again, then we'll be able to enter you at 2021 for your exams at that point. Okay, so bearing that in mind, I do think it's important to try and get the rest of the way through the Grapes of Wrath as a text. We've finished all the rest of them. So next couple of weeks, I will put up stuff for the Grapes of Wrath, and then a bit more sporadically after that, I'll put up some kind of revision resources, just to make sure that if it happens, everybody's had all the content kind of delivered. Okay. So in terms of what we're looking at, we're focusing on kind of chapter 20 to 22. And a few different things that we'll kind of pull out. So the first thing at this stage, as we get towards the end of the novel, what I've really been pushing, and you'll have seen this with Doll's House and Coleridge, really starting to think about the comparisons between the two texts. It's not something you want to be making up or thinking about for the first time in the exam. You want to have those comparisons in mind early on, so that yes, you need to adapt to the question, but you can already make a number of kind of sophisticated comparisons without having to kind of think of them on the fly, essentially. Now, one of the things that Steinbeck does across these chapters is he essentially points out, well, what is the practical problem with farming in the modern age? And it kind of comes down to essentially a lack of ownership. So we're going to look at that. Then we will do that comparison. Now, you probably already looked at this, but this will just be a kind of drawing out of the points you've made. That comparison between the Hooverville and the Weed Patch camps, and just drawing out some of the key features of kind of difference between the two camps, so that you'd be able to talk about them together and kind of suggest the reasoning why Steinbeck is kind of showing both, and what the kind of his purpose is in doing so. And then I'm just going to make a kind of brief point around a kind of philosophical debate, essentially, that Steinbeck puts into the narrative. Just kind of, he's essentially debating around what it needs, or what you need to be or feel human, essentially. Okay, so that's the kind of general aim for today. The other bits of the chapters we'll draw out tomorrow. Okay, so this is just for today, and then tomorrow we'll do the other bits. So the first thing, a bit like I did with Doll's House and Coleridge, you need to think about comparison points before you ever go into the exam. So I've got a few examples here. The first one you might have, both of them, Steinbeck and Fitzgerald, explore the kind of the way the poor are marginalised, but you can then draw out into a difference, and Steinbeck is far more sympathetic towards the poor, whereas for Fitzgerald, yes, they're marginalised, yes, they're suffering, but they're a bit grubby and disgusting, and there's far less sympathy for them. You can look at how both of them show kind of capitalist consumerism, destroying the world around us. They reflect kind of wholly bleak and corrupting image. You get the Valley of Ashes in Fitzgerald. You get that kind of shallow consumeristic culture. Whereas in Steinbeck, obviously, you get this whole destruction of the Joad family, their way of life, and not just the Joads, but the whole of the migrant community. And Fitzgerald, yes, he provides at least an image of outer beauty. Steinbeck is far more brutal. He cuts straight to this kind of bleak view. So last one I'm going to give you directly. So they both kind of show a fading religious idea, that it's been essentially replaced by a worship of money. But you can then think about differences. So does Steinbeck want a new kind of religion coming in? Fitzgerald never really shows us a kind of alternative. He simply shows us that religion is kind of fading away, essentially. So what I want you to do, this kind of first task of the day, I would recommend you spend kind of 10 minutes or so doing this now, but you should be adding to this over and over again. Every time you suddenly have a little thought and you're, oh, I could compare in relation to that, you should be adding to this list. So this list that you're making now should get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? So you might think how you could compare around kind of ideas of women. You might think about kind of ideas of masculinity coming into it. You might talk about the pastoral. You might talk about community, human connection, etc., etc., etc. I would recommend, so you should have somewhere between kind of 20, 30 points of comparison in a list. You can have, there's loads of other ways to compare than that. Sit down now for kind of 10 minutes, see what you can come up with off the top of your head. You can use those to kind of come up with comparison points. I'll suggest a couple of others, but you need to be thinking about these kind of points of comparison beforehand. So if you pause me at this point, have a go at kind of drawing out those key points, okay? Okay, so adding to this list, rather just women, you might have said something like, well, in Fitzgerald, in The Great Gatsby, women are very often kind of weak, powerless. Their only power comes through the male figures in their lives, whereas there's that kind of switch from the patriarchy to matriarchy in The Grapes of Wrath. Masculinity, again, you can get the toxic nature of it at certain points. In Fitzgerald, you get the kind of reversal, taking away of masculinity. We can see this in Steinbeck as well. Both of them have that kind of pastoral, that old farming ideal fading away, but in different ways. You have the Valley of Ashes with its fantastic farms, as opposed to the kind of more extended image within the Grapes of Wrath. In terms of, we look at the kind of etc., you might look at, well, both of them use cars as symbols, or technology becomes symbolic within the narratives. You might look at, what else might we look at? You might compare the ways that kind of criminality are dealt with in both of them. The ways that, both Gatsby and Tom Joad are in a sense criminals, but they don't lose their nobility through their criminality. You might look at alcohol in both of them, the way in which kind of it links to prohibition in one, whereas in the other you get kind of Uncle John, and the way that he uses alcohol to kind of hide, essentially. So there's lots of different things you should be kind of adding to this list. Make it long, make this part of your revision, and it's also going to help you, well, look at the text and go, how would I actually prove that? I know that that's a point of comparison, but what textual detail do I then need to take forward? Right, okay, so one of the things that is kind of pointed out here, and in the kind of this book, it's page 257. In the other book, it's page 288 to 89, is the way in which Steinbeck kind of deals with the problems of farming when you don't own the land. I have got this kind of saved that I'm using, and I've altered slightly, which does have the kind of yellow book numbers. It doesn't have it for all of it, I'm afraid. So if you've got the yellow book, some of this is going to be a bit awkward. I'll tell you where a bit starts and ends. But you will just have to kind of find it within the relevant chapters yourself to kind of use, okay? So the bit I'm interested in on page 257 is from How About What I Said, Tom resumed, I seen all the stuff growing, and just that paragraph that follows, the big paragraph, that's how it is, okay? Now, I want you to just read through that with the question in mind that I'm kind of posing there. Steinbeck is kind of again, it's all about the points he's trying to make in the narrative. He's exploring this issue around farming when ownership is taken away. What is the consequences? And then just think, how can you actually evidence that? You can't quote the entire paragraph. Which bits of that paragraph would you point out to show that Steinbeck is exploring this kind of the consequences when people don't have ownership, when people don't have the control over their own land? So spend 5 minutes, just read over that section, see what you can draw out, see which bits of evidence you draw out. So pause me at this point, and then I'll kind of go through which bits I'd pick out and the kind of overall points I'd make. Okay, so let's just consider this then. On your typical old style farm, the kind of farm that the Joads would have come from, yes, they have a kind of key harvesting season, but because of its kind of small scale nature, because it's kind of family run, the family are there all year round. They are, yes, working harder at one point, but they are not kind of discarded when there's less work. They're there, they're present the whole way through. But what Steinbeck kind of points out here is that when farms become too large scale, when people lose ownership, they themselves become a commodity, something that is only needed at certain points in time, and they are kind of, you can simply discard them when they're not needed. So some of the bits you might kind of point out here. There's a big son of a bitch of a peach orchard I worked for. That kind of the response of the kind of migrant community here, that there's a hostility towards this new process. 3,000 men for 2 weeks, whereas it talks elsewhere takes 9 men all year round. So that kind of disparity, that for 2 weeks out of a whole year you need 3,000 people, but for the rest of the year you need only 9. Well, what do those other people do for the rest of the year? Because the harvest season is a very narrow season, so there is that kind of sense of kind of, you know, just that lost time in between. You are only interested in people when they serve a purpose. And a couple of other bits you might kind of pick out. Again, that reference to the kind of the handbills that they send out, they send all over hell. And the way that because they get 6,000, they're able to force the wages down. And the way they're discarded at the end. So think about that closing point. You might steal, you might get drunk, you might just raise hell, and besides, you don't look nice living in old tents and it's a pretty country, but you stink it up. They don't want you around. So you can comment there that they become essentially a waste product. As soon as their functional use is over, they become a waste, essentially. Now, it's a nice bit to pick out here. It allows you to talk about kind of Steinbeck's intentions in kind of doing this. It's also an interesting point in the you can link into things like when we looked at Death of a Salesman, the way that Willy Loman talks about himself. He sort of says, you know, a man is not a piece of fruit. You can't eat the orange and throw away the peel. And that's what's happening to these people here. The difference between them and Willy Loman is they kind of recognize that this is happening to them. Willy Loman, you know, he's just confused about the whole system. I mean, none of you will actually kind of, you know, keep the peel after every orange you eat, but he doesn't understand that, you know, that commercial system he's living in does treat men as a piece of fruit. You are only valuable for what you can kind of make for them. Okay, right, we then move on, and hopefully you've already kind of had a look at this, but you get the Hooverville camps and you get the Weed Patch camps. So either drag out your notes, have a look over them, or if you haven't done it, you're a bad human being and you should have done. You want to have a look at these two kind of in comparison. They're cut across 2 separate chapters. We're looking at kind of quite a wide space of the novel here, but the more sophisticated points, not always, but generally the more sophisticated points are going to be those where you're able to kind of create comparison across the text, where you can see those points of parallelism and contrast. Okay, to set it up, the Hooverville camps on the kind of the left hand side here, they are those kind of, they're every roadside camp, every kind of dumping ground camp on the edge of the towns. They're not, the Hooverville camp is not one specific camp. They're called Hoovervilles because of President Hoover, and the implication is that they are a consequence of his kind of policies. Okay, so they're the kind of the bad camps. The page references there, I have got the yellow book ones on this one. So if you're on the yellow book, it's the kind of one in brackets. If you're on the blue book, it's the ones before blue, green, teal book. The weed patch camp is the one on the right. That's a picture of one of the kind of the weed patch camps, essentially. Again, I mean, you can actually just talk about the name of the camp itself. The fact that this is where all the migrants are being put, it's referred to as the weed patch camp. Think what that implies about the migrants themselves, that they are essentially weeds. They're something undesirable. They are something that people seek to kind of root out and destroy. Having said that, there's a more positive view of it. Weeds are those things that keep coming back. The weeds are arguably the sort of more resilient plants over those that have been kind of consciously planted. So it's also a kind of place of regrowth as well. It's both a place where you put people that are undesirable, but it's also the regrowth idea. So what I want you to do, and I would expect this to probably take about 20, maybe a bit longer minutes, have a look and compare those two camps, probably on a page or something, split it in half, see what kind of points of comparison you can make between them. Think not just about the kind of setting itself directly, think about the people, think about the way the atmosphere is depicted, think about the kind of contrasts there. How is the setting affecting the people who are part of that setting as well? Okay, so pause me at this point. As I say, spend about 20-25 minutes having a look through at this, see what points you pick out. I'll then pick out a few points that I'll kind of go through, but there'll be lots more that we could have gone through if we kind of got time, but I'm trying to keep the videos to a kind of sensible length. Okay, so there are various points of kind of comparison you can make. Steinbeck kind of clearly shows that one of these camps is a place of order, whereas one is a place of kind of disorder. So if we think about the introduction to the weed patch camp, there was no order in the camp. Little grey tents, shacks, cars were scattered about at random. And if you then kind of flip across to the other one, no, I want the other bit. Here we are. Tom walked down the street between the row of tents. He saw the rows were straight and then there was no litter about the tents. So he's showing us one is a kind of, a place of refuse. It's a place of kind of, it's a bleak place. As opposed to the other, you're giving people order. You are giving them structure, and this is a good thing. What else do we have? So, let's just, okay. So there's other ways that kind of he highlights the kind of the refuse of the Hooverville camp, the kind of the rubbish making it up. There's an inconsistency to everything. Each tent is kind of made up of kind of bits, made of 3 sheets of rusty corrugated iron, mouldy carpet tacked between 2 boards, and there's even kind of grass being used to kind of harvest, to kind of do the roofing. And he kind of describes in this Hooverville camp, they're hung a slovenly despair. So slovenly is kind of dirty, and despair is sort of, we're focusing on the atmosphere here. But he's clearly associating the kind of the dirt and the filth with this kind of human emotion that goes with it. It's sort of reducing their humanity, forcing people to live in this way is kind of hurting them, essentially. So you're thinking about kind of Steinbeck's points here. As it goes kind of further through, there's attempts to keep order in this Hooverville camp. You get reference to kind of the bucket full of soaking clothes, the huge tent, but there is kind of the pink dresses hanging out and several pairs of overalls. But the people are dirty. So the little boy's overalls and bare feet, their hair was grey with dust. So it's a place of dirt, and where there is a kind of attempt to keep it clean, the dirt in front of the tent had been swept and sprinkled. So people are keeping their own area clean. They're trying to kind of preserve their own humanity within a small area, but it's not across the whole camp. There's no community here. Each tent is sort of presented as an individual world unto itself. And when they first arrive, you think about the people here as well. The tents of the first shack parted and a woman looked out. Her hair was braided and she wore a dirty, flowered Mother Hubbard. Her face was wizened and dull, deep grey pouches under her blank eyes and a mouth slack and loose. So this first person they meet is, again, described as dirty. The dirt becomes important here. And there's no response from this person. There's a kind of hostility. They simply withdrawn inside the shack. So there's no greeting, there's no introduction, there's no connection between the individuals here. And all of this kind of feeds into the comparison into the other camp. Okay, so as we kind of go back across to the Weed Patch camp, there. Right, sorry, I just want to find the bits that I want. It's important that kind of, the whole thing is organised by sanitary unit, by cleaning unit. So as Tom enters on page 301, he neared number 40 sanitary unit and looked at it curiously. An unpainted building, low and rough, under a roof, but open at the sides, the rows of wash trays. He saw the Joe truck standing nearby and went quietly towards it. So he's instantly drawn to the sanitary unit, to this place of washing, to the cleanliness here. And we actually have a constructed building as well. So opposed to the kind of all these things that have been kind of just thrown together, we do have things that have been built, something more permanent and lasting. Okay, so on page 301, the other bit to kind of point out here, you've got a repeat of some of the imagery of the Hooverville camp. So rather than just the area outside the tent had been swept and sprinkled, this time the ground of the street had been swept and sprinkled. So we're moving in these camps from kind of desperately trying to preserve individual kind of cleanliness and standards to a community effort here. It's changed across the two camps. Steinbeck is depicting this as better. This is what the government should be doing. The government should be providing these places because it allows people to kind of return to their humanity. So if we kind of skip through, and then the other bit around kind of the Weed Patch camp. Okay, so as we look at kind of further through on page 314 and 315, again, it's important that Steinbeck focuses again on the sanitary units. They are the first image of the morning, essentially. The sun leapt over the mountain by now, shone on the corrugated iron roofs of the 5 sanitary units, shone on the grey tents on the swept ground of the streets between the tents. So again, it's that focus on the clean nature, that community cleaning. You've got the focus on the sanitary units, and in terms of the kind of pathetic fallacy here, you've got, again, a far more kind of attractive image of this place. It's the sun shining on it, and as opposed to the people who were withdrawn into their tents in the Hooverville camp, in that opening image, you get kind of the smell of smoke was in the air, tent flaps were thrown back, and people moved about in the streets. So by providing that kind of community aspect, you prevent people from kind of going completely introverted here. And Mar then kind of is depicted as kind of exploring this setting as you go on to page 315, and Steinbeck has her kind of go into the sanitary unit. She walked to the wash basins, ran her finger over the white porcelain. She turned the little water tap on, held her finger in the stream. She jerks it back because it's hot. They've got hot water to kind of cleanse themselves here. And that again is kind of important within this setting. And again, kind of as she goes through, she washed her hands in the warm water. She washed her face. Okay, so the washing, this place of order, there's everything lined up, there's space to clean, and it brings the community together. And Steinbeck presents this in a positive way, in a good way. So he's essentially showing, if you want to make a kind of contextual point, he's showing, Hooverville camp bad. This is a consequence of kind of inaction, of kind of in people suffering, whereas the weed patch camp is the good place. This is what the government should be doing because it returns people to that state of humanity. It gives them what they need to kind of survive, and survive in a way that keeps them human. It doesn't dehumanize them. Okay, what I want you to do, this kind of final activity we'll do for today around it, the kind of philosophical discourses. So it kind of, I'm building on that kind of community aspect here, and the cleaning aspect. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do, because I think it's nice to have a kind of contemporary example of this, I would like you to just have a watch. The link possibly won't work very well, but search for that into YouTube. Have a watch of the video, because essentially that video shows the same thing that Steinbeck's showing. That's showing it in a real instance, whereas he's kind of fictionalizing it, but it's the same inference, it's the same idea. So just pause me a minute. It's only like a 2-3 minute video. Just have a watch of the video. Think about what it shows you about people's needs. Okay, so I think it's an interesting video. It shows kind of, for homeless people living on the streets, that simply having a haircut, simply having human contact, it kind of returns them to a state of normalcy, essentially. They are given back something that is important in making them human. Now, Steinbeck essentially does the same thing within the novel. So the bit that we'll kind of point out here, and I think some bits of it are going to be cut off by the little video in the corner, but never mind. You've got kind of this bit. You've got Rose here. So hang on a second. Okay, sorry. So Rose here, it starts out and we get this kind of image of her as kind of unclean even, sorry. So Mar looks at her. She looked at the girl's wrinkled, dirty dress, at the frizzled, uncombed hair. You got to clean up, she said briskly. And as it kind of goes through, well, she kind of denies this. She says, I don't feel good. I wish Connie would come. I don't feel like doing nothing without Connie. But Mar is concerned about creating a good impression, about appearances. She's concerned about the ladies' committee coming. Now, if you look slightly further on from this section, Dun, 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 dun. Yeah. So cleaning becomes important. If you then look a few pages ahead, so around 5 pages ahead, when Rose returns here, okay, and she returns clean, and that cleaning is very important. She's kind of transformed in that cleaning and is given a kind of totally different appearance. So you're looking kind of at the top of page 321, the bit I put your stuff on a plate, Ma said. And then she looked closely at the girl. Her hair was dripping and combed, and her skin was bright and pink. She put on the blue dress printed with little white flowers. On her feet she wore the heeled slippers of her wedding. She blushed under Ma's gaze. You had a bath, Ma said. Rose of Sharon spoke huskily. I was in there and a lady come in and done it. Know what you do? You get a little stool like, and you turn the handles and water comes flooding down on you, hot water or cold water, just like you want it. And I done it. So from the kind of wrinkled dirtiness, the frizzled, uncombed appearance, from the kind of sickness she's claiming earlier on, she's transformed into a kind of back into an image of beauty simply by being clean, by being cleansed here in this camp. And there's an excitement that goes with it. Her dialogue here shows that she is, she enjoys this experience. It's important to her. It's kind of that return to humanity is central to Rose here. So Steinbeck is kind of demonstrating this, and it goes further down on the page as well. Dun, 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 dun. I'm going to do it every day, the girl said. And that lady, she's seen me and she's seen about the baby, and know what she said? Said there's a nurse comes every week, and I'm going to go and see the nurse and tell me just what to do so the baby's strong. So there's also that kind of healthcare element that comes into this as well. Steinbeck is very interested in kind of showing just how important this government support can be. It's too limited in his view. There is kind of very few of these government camps, but they are kind of centrally important in kind of returning people to a state of humanity. And he sees that as kind of central. Okay. So that's enough for kind of this point. We're going to build on this tomorrow, though. Okay. We're going to kind of look at the way in which Rose goes from this point, and she's then kind of brought low again, and the kind of the reasons that Steinbeck implies for this, what he's kind of got behind it. We're going to kind of think about the kind of police corruption at various points across the chapters, and various other points like this. Okay. So tomorrow I'll also send you out the kind of the reading advice for the closing chapters as well. Okay. Right. I'll see you tomorrow with it, people. Bye bye.